June 13th, 1996. Idaho Falls, Idaho. 18-year-old Angie Dodge was found brutally murdered in her apartment. A crime so savage, it haunted the small town for decades. But what followed was not just a hunt for her killer. It was a story of wrongful conviction, shattered lives, and groundbreaking DNA technology that would finally reveal the truth. 23 years later,
a public DNA database led to an arrest for a cold case from more than 2 decades ago. Angie Dodge was murdered in Idaho Falls back in 1996.
Investigators turned to a genealogy website to try to solve a young woman's murder. 18-year-old Angie Dodge was killed at her home in Idaho Falls. The killer left DNA at the scene, but police could not find a match for nearly 2 decades.
Idaho Falls, 1996. A quiet, close-knit community where crime was rare and neighbors knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where people didn't bother locking their doors at night. A town that felt safe. But all of that changed on the morning of June 13th, 1996. 18-year-old Angie Dodge had just moved into her first apartment. She was described by friends as kind, playful, and full of life. A young woman with dreams of independence. Her mother, Carol Dodge, was proud of her daughter, but like any parent, worried about her living alone for the first time. That morning, Angie didn't show up for work. At first, her co-workers thought she might be late, but as the hours passed, concern began to grow. One of her co-workers decided to check on her. What they found inside would haunt Idaho Falls forever. Angie's body was discovered in her bedroom. She had been brutally attacked, raped, and murdered. The crime scene was violent, bloody, and far too shocking for the small-town officers who had rarely seen anything like it. The brutality of the murder sent waves of fear through the community. People who once felt safe in their homes now double-checked their locks. Mothers kept a closer eye on their daughters, and whispers of a killer roaming free spread across town. But amidst the horror, investigators found one crucial clue: semen left behind by the attacker. It was a lead, a piece of evidence that would become both the key to solving the crime and the reason it remained unsolved for decades. The murder of Angie Dodge shook the community to its core, and with growing fear came growing pressure. Police needed answers. The town wanted a killer behind bars. But when weeks turned into months with no arrests, desperation began to creep into the investigation, and soon, suspicion fell on a young man named Christopher Tapp. Chris was just 20 years old. He wasn't a violent criminal. In fact, he had no history of violent behavior at all. But he was young, vulnerable, and easily influenced. Police believed he might know something, or someone, connected to the murder. What followed was a series of interrogations that would later be described as psychological warfare. For more than 100 hours, across multiple sessions, Chris was grilled, manipulated, and pressured. Detectives told him he was failing lie detector tests. They hinted that if he didn't cooperate, his friends or even his family could be implicated. And worst of all, they dangled promises of leniency, even immunity, if he just told the truth. Under this crushing pressure, Chris broke. He began repeating details fed to him by investigators. His statements shifted, changed, and contradicted the physical evidence. But eventually, police extracted what they wanted: a confession. Despite the fact that his DNA did not match the semen found at the crime scene, the confession was enough to sway a jury. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of the rape and murder of Angie Dodge and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. But behind the scenes, doubts remained. The physical evidence didn't line up. The confession was shaky at best, and Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, couldn't shake the feeling that the wrong man was behind bars, while her daughter's real killer was still free. While Christopher Tapp sat behind bars, convicted of her daughter's murder, Carol Dodge never found peace. Unlike many victims' families who try to move on, Carol couldn't. Something about the case gnawed at her. The confession didn't match the crime scene. The DNA evidence excluded Tapp completely, and deep down, Carol knew the real killer was still out there. For years, she pushed police and prosecutors to re-examine the case. She studied interrogation tapes, dug through court records, and became an investigator in her own right. Carol wasn't just a grieving mother. She became the voice of reason in a system that had failed her daughter. Her persistence paid off. With advancements in DNA science, the case took a dramatic turn. By the late 2000s, a new investigative tool was emerging: genetic genealogy. Instead of relying solely on direct DNA matches, investigators could now build family trees using DNA samples uploaded to genealogy databases. From there, they could track down suspects through relatives. In 2019, the Idaho Falls Police Department partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company at the cutting edge of this technology. Using the semen sample recovered from Angie's apartment in 1996, Parabon's genealogists built a profile and then a family tree. The search narrowed, piece by piece, relative by relative. They traced the lineage back to one man, a man who had lived right across the street from Angie Dodge at the time of her murder. His name was Brian Lee Dripps. For Carol Dodge, it was both vindication and heartbreak. She had been right all along. The wrong man had been imprisoned, while the real killer had walked free for more than 2 decades. In May 2019, detectives finally knocked on the door of Brian Lee Dripps, the quiet neighbor who had once lived across the street from Angie Dodge. Dripps was now 53 years old, married, and living an unremarkable life. On the surface, he seemed like just another ordinary man. But behind closed doors, he had carried a dark secret for more than 2 decades. Detectives obtained a cigarette butt that Dripps had discarded, and when they tested the DNA, the results were undeniable. It was a perfect match to the semen found at Angie's crime scene. The truth was out. After 23 years, the killer had finally been identified. Confronted with the evidence, Dripps confessed.
Today we're here to announce that we have arrested Brian Lee Dripps for the murder and rape of Angie Dodge.
He admitted to breaking into Angie Dodge's apartment on that summer night in 1996, raping her, and then brutally stabbing her to death. When asked why, his answers were chillingly hollow. He claimed he had been drunk, that he hadn't planned it, as if that could excuse the horror of what he had done. For Angie's mother, Carol, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, justice had finally been served. The man who destroyed her daughter's life was now behind bars. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the 20 years that Christopher Tapp had spent wrongfully imprisoned, years stolen from him, because police had been too desperate for a conviction. In 2021, Brian Dripps pled guilty to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 20 years before he could even be considered for parole. Justice had finally arrived, but far too late. After more than 2 decades, the truth about Angie Dodge's murder was finally known. The wrong man, Christopher Tapp, walked out of prison in 2019, exonerated at last. He had lost 20 years of his life for a crime he did not commit. A tragic reminder of how dangerous false confessions and tunnel vision in policing can be. For Carol Dodge, justice was a long, painful journey. She had fought relentlessly, not just for her daughter, but also for the truth. It was her persistence that kept the case alive, her refusal to accept easy answers that brought the real killer to light. And Angie? She was more than a victim. She was a young woman with dreams, laughter, and a future stolen. Her case has become a symbol of why justice matters and why it must be pursued carefully, with patience and truth above all else. The murder of Angie Dodge also changed the course of criminal investigations forever. Genetic genealogy, the very tool that unmasked Brian Dripps, is now solving cold cases across the world, bringing long-awaited answers to families who thought they would never know what happened to their loved ones. But perhaps the greatest legacy is Carol's, a grieving mother who turned her pain into determination, ensuring that her daughter's voice was never silenced. In the end, justice came, not quickly, not easily, and not without sacrifice. But it came, and Angie Dodge's story will never be forgotten.